Good. I'm going to start. Good evening, one and all. It gives me immense pleasure that Surya Sankar Sen has agreed to speak on our forum, Association of Indian Research Scholars, or AIRS. We have been active since September 2020, and we have successfully hosted eminent scholars, including Noam Chomsky, Professor Joseph Nye, Professor Hargopal, Professor Rajan Harshe, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Afroz Alam, Professor Mohammad Muazzam Ali, and others. We have also recently released two newsletters, both of which included not just webinar reports, but also opinion pieces by scholars from across India. So if you have any piece you would like to publish, do consider sending it to us on our official mail. We are also available on all social media platforms, so do connect with us, share, like, and subscribe for updates and notifications. This is a special day for me as I am moderating today's session on a very relevant topic. My name is Evangeline Nonklau, and I am a PhD scholar at the Department of English from the University of Hyderabad. And now, let me introduce our speaker. So, Surya Sankar Sen is a final year PhD research scholar from the School of Conflict and Security Studies. His PhD thesis, titled Implications of Local Conflicts on Bilateral Relations, a case study of land boundary and enclave conflicts on India Bangladesh relations, will seek to understand the implications of local conflict on interstate relations. The study will focus on the differences in perception regarding issues of nationality, territoriality, and citizenship within the former enclaves of the India Bangladesh border and their renderings at the level of policy in integrating them to the larger national space through a bilateral agreement. The study will seek to understand the impact that these two distinct understandings have at the local and bilateral levels in prompting interactions between groups, individuals, and between states. Surya also holds an MPhil in International Relations from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. His research interests focus on understanding borderland processes and conflicts in South Asia. Now, his recent publications include situating the local in bilateralism, assessing local impacts of the India Bangladesh Enclave Exchange, which was published in the Jadavpur Journal of International Relations, and another which is entitled Borders, Citizenship at and the Local Everyday Life in Three Districts of West Bengal, which was published in Borders in Globalization Review. That is all, and I'm handing the floor over to you, Surya.
Thank you so much. Good evening, and thank you for being in attendance for this talk. I look forward to answering your questions as well as receiving any feedback that you may have at the end of my presentation. So the topic that I will be speaking on, it constitutes one of the central ideas of my doctoral thesis. So I'm quite close to finalizing and submitting my thesis in the next couple of months, and I eagerly look forward to your feedback on the same. So thank you for having me. I'll just need some time because just to figure out if the slides are working properly. If at any moment if it's not transitioning into the next slide, do let me know. There shouldn't be any problem. We've done a dummy run already. So this is the larger structure of my presentation. So I will be spending a considerable amount of time basically talking about the study, and then moving on to the major themes that I have dealt with and the findings. The topic that I have chosen today is part of the larger central thesis that I have been working on. So the primary objective of this study basically arose from trying to understand the localized impacts of interstate mediation in conflicts. And once I spent some time understanding how the bilateral agreement to resolve the India-Bangladesh border issues with regard to the exchange of enclaves took place, it became very clear that the semantics underlying resolution processes not only confined to this particular instance, but generally, they often tend to obscure the operation of, say, certain tendencies which contribute to the shifts in the nature and form of local conflicts subsequent to the state's entry into these spaces. So, as a consequence, what happens is that issues that persist are often viewed as dissociated from preceding localized conditions, which might impede upon bringing forth an effective resolution of such conflicts. So the persistence of such conflicts, they also impact upon not only interstate relations, but also local conditions as well. And often, such conflicts that are sought to be addressed through bilateral, say, resolutions, they often come to be subsumed under categories of understanding as well as perception that align very closely to the nature of relations that are shared between the two acting countries. So, based on this understanding, I have selected a case study of the land boundary agreement between India and Bangladesh, primarily looking at the resolution of the enclave issues, whereby I have tried to look at the processes of exclusion of the local from national and bilateral narratives. So the primary aim of this larger study, and the talk is basically a part of this thesis that I've worked on. So the primary aim was propelled by the need to basically introduce and accept the local as a very important referent in the study of international relations. So the primacy of the state, I argue, it often obscures our perspective from looking at the more localized nuances of such conflicts. So the predominance of the state in discussions on interstate conflict, it has based understandings and processes related to the functioning of the state on what I state are abstractions of what constitutes its own associated interests within the larger domain of national interest. So if you look at the exclusion of the local from discussions of conflict resolutions primarily, especially from a bilateral approach, it often inhibits a very comprehensive understanding of the issue that the resolution process seeks to engage with. So this partial interpretation that is then acted upon, it constitutes the foundations upon which the inherent addressability of the issue is determined. So basically identifying a scope to engage with this concept of bilateralism in a more comprehensive manner, whereby the local narratives of a conflict or a situation or an issue is engaged with, often opens up the possibility of accepting certain alternative discourses, okay, which are often obscured from statist or national perspectives. So this is basically what the study wants to put forward. So what I want to explore through this talk are the variable perceptions and negotiations around the presence of these previously stateless enclaves to basically understand the disjuncture that exists between statist enumerations of the existence of enclaves and their localized manifestations that emerge through interactions and processes surrounding these spaces as well as their extent limitations. Therefore, what I would like to state at the very beginning of this talk is that the larger idea is based on this premise that to gather an understanding derived from local experiences allows for a more nuanced understanding of such categories that are often delimited by states in the resolution processes. Okay, so establishing such a premise basically allows for a more critical exploration of, say, prevalent local conflicts in which I will engage with in the subsequent section. Okay, so I'll move on to the statement of the problem. So I I spoke about the larger subject that my research deals with, and most of the postulations that I will put forward are based on this site of inquiry. So the bilateral resolution of the India-Bangladesh enclave issue, it offers a very interesting case to engage with in trying to find out the impacts or the implications of the absence of the local from such bilateral or national perspectives. So concerns surrounding the existence of India-Bangladesh border enclaves, it featured, in fact, as a very important issue in their bilateral relations up to their resolution in 2015. So the emphasis that was put forth on the provision of citizenship and the recognition, of the territorial status of such previously stateless spaces did not, however, bring forth a very substantial local transformation, barring just the insertion of the state and its institutions as the primary purveyors of, say, benefits or mobilities that were previously negotiated by local actors. So the prevalence of a national interpretation of, say, a very local issue, whereby it attributes a very singular, let's just say, interpretation of this entire conflict, okay, in understanding it through just the provision of citizenship or the exchange of territories as a means towards resolution. What it did was it glossed over local contestations which existed as a result of the presence of enclaves at the India-Bangladesh border. So, besides the formal recognition of enclaves as national territory and its residents as citizens, um, statelessness to some extent persists at the local level even today. Okay, and in fact, it continues to impact upon India-Bangladesh relations with regard to the management of their shared border as well as its associated issues of migration, mobility, whether legal or illegal. So, through this talk, I basically want to bring forward an analysis of how the persistence of such issues and their impact upon bilateral relations can be understood through an, let's say, inquiry into the problematic of the exclusion of local narratives from bilateral resolution processes. Okay, so the following research questions and objectives have been determined based upon the premise that I just presented to you. I'll pause on this slide for a moment so that all of you get a very basic idea of the larger work that this idea I'm presenting is a part of. And in fact, I will deal with these objectives and questions in the subsequent sections by engaging with a very thematic breakdown of my research findings. And hopefully, at the end of it, place the larger question within such a context. So, these are the basic questions and objectives that I have worked on or identified with regard to this issue. Okay, so to begin with, I would like to basically situate this larger idea on an understanding of what enclaves are. I'm sure most of you have heard of the enclaves or these territorial spaces. These were basically fragmented portions of stateless territories that were embedded within the national territory of the other country. Okay, I have a pictographic depiction of the enclaves which would enable you to understand the kind of situation or the challenges or circumstances that people residing within these enclaves had to go through. Very obvious limitations to their mobilities or the kind of relationships that they could have not only with the territory that they were embedded in, but also the people that they shared their lives with. So if this is India, Bangladeshi enclave existed within India, as a result of which the citizens, or not citizens, the residents of these enclaves were devoid of, say, basic provisions of citizenship or the protections that such an identity comes with. So through the exchange of 2015, what happened is that these enclaves became integrated within the national spaces that they were a part of. The land boundary agreement of 2015, in fact, also facilitated an exchange of population determined by whether the people residing within these spaces would consent to moving. In fact, religious identity constituted a very important push factor that prompted a lot of Muslims from India to migrate into Bangladesh and vice versa. So there are plenty of instances of local conflict that I will examine in the subsequent sections. So this study is based on an ethnographic analysis of two former Bangladeshi enclaves in the Kuch Bihar district of West Bengal. It's in the northern part of West Bengal, as well as former Indian enclave of Bangladesh. I spent close to around 10 to 11 months in these places. I mean, in different, in a very staggered way to basically capture the local narratives that were associated with the exchange. So, in fact, I took an ethnographic approach in order to basically facilitate a view of local realities and also to shift away from the primacy that was accorded to the state in all discussions related to the land boundary agreement. So these sites were in fact selected from a list of enclaves that met certain established criteria that the study had identified. Some criteria being, say, proximity to the border or sites of interstate conflict, as well as recorded inhabitancy. Okay, so the criticalities of this study basically necessitated the approach in order to situate the local as a very important referent in the analysis of interstate conflicts. So the kind of methods that were used were participant observations, semi-structured interviews, as well as focus group discussions at these selected field sites. And in fact, what happened after the beginning of the pandemic is that I carried on certain telephonic interviews with respondents to basically take stock of recent developments, especially with the issue of land ownership, which was still undergoing a lot of changes at the time I departed from the field. Okay, so to largely situate the history of the enclaves within the history of the South Asian borderlands, we also have to look at the emergence of the South Asian borderland as a very significant site of state action. Okay, so in the South Asian context, the significance of borders, especially in terms of, say, the regulatory or delimiting functions that they perform, has been mostly the preserve of the modern state. In fact, the significance, if you look at the borders as the limits of its power, of the state's power, it has undergone a lot of reconfigurations in, say, the territorial context of an interconnected regional space. And these reconfigurations have basically taken place to include, say, processes whereby the state's authority is always or continually reinforced against any kind of recession. Okay, so in viewing the border as basically the limit of state power, often this particular understanding has been used to justify its securitization by the state. Okay, so in such elucidations, what you will find is that borders are represented as only the sites of separation from other states. Okay, and these states are represented as being in pursuit of very divergent or irreconcilable interests. And all of these states following exist within a continuum of, say, very limited potentials for cooperation, as well as sparse resources. So, based on this understanding, similarly, conflicts at the borders are also viewed as a very apparent corollary of its existence at the site, as a site separating two entities, okay, embodying primarily very incompatible interests. So the identification of what may be considered as being disruptive or, say, contributing to the origination of conflicts basically depends upon various factors, especially with regard to the borders. Okay, but however, what you will notice is that such estimations often remain confined in a lot of ways to the potential implications that it will have on the attainment of national interest objectives. Okay, therefore, what happens in as a consequence is that the representation of the local in such explanation, it often appears to be constructed through, say, the focus of the state and its interests. So the subjectivities that underlie statist discourses on local conflicts can be elicited through a study of the variance of responses that you will find across different situations. Okay, and this point is something that is not novel. In fact, it is quite widely used by the subjectivist critique of national interest, which basically states that state intervention leading to the transformation of, say, a local issue into a national issue is only initiated if the same issue is perceived as being related to the attainment of the state's national interests. Okay, so based on this understanding, this study puts forth that um, the implications of this will be the persistence of a particular issue or conflict whereby the state mediates beyond the declaration of its formal resolution. Okay, what happens in such local sites of conflict is that the conflict is not resolved, but it stands fundamentally transformed, okay, through such intervention. Okay. So the means of remediation are in fact also constituted through an engagement of with factors, say, that are resonant with the state's own national interests. Okay, and as a result, it fails to recognize the persistence of conflicts at the local level in other forms. Okay, so the understanding of conflicts at the national as well as the interstate levels with regard to, say, locally operating conflicts, it often appears to be very dissociated from the realities of the existence of such issues. Okay, as well as there is also such an absence of the recognition of local from the assessments of the localized impacts of, say, of the resolution of such conflicts. Okay, so critically analyzing the assessments of, say, conflicts at the borders and subsequent policies for their resolution, they often reveal a very similar pattern of obscuration. Okay, in fact, the local, as this study puts forth, is constituted of an interactive and interpretative framework of different networks, which in fact affect upon, say, actions and choices of its constituent actors. And therefore, it needs to be recognized as a very significant element of any spatiality, whether it is with regard to borders or whether it is with regard to any other site of conflict. Okay. So although the LBA, the Land Boundary Agreement, in fact, has been studied quite widely in international relations as to understand, basically understand the combination of certain regional factors that have contributed to a very successful example of bilateral cooperation, the scope of engagement must, however, be considered in such analysis. So, besides the formal recognition of the enclave residents as citizens and the enclave land as national territory, the conflicts and vulnerabilities associated with the erstwhile statelessness of these spaces even persists at the local level even today. Okay, so the emphasis on the provision of citizenship and territorial status in fact did not bring forth substantial local transformations. And these are findings that have been arrived at from an engagement with, say, the narratives from the field. Okay, so the persistence of or rather the prevalence of a national interpretation of a local issue in, say, attributing a very singular emphasis on the provision of citizenship and the exchange of territories as a means towards resolving a larger conflict, what it did was it glossed over local contestations which existed as a result of it. Okay, and in fact, at a discursive level, it also, in fact, stymied engagement beyond the contestations that it had outlined, that the resolution process had outlined. So in, let's say, in confining the scope of this larger issue to the ascription of citizenship or the exchange of territory, the component of the local is completely absent from such analysis. Okay, and if you look at the India-Bangladesh border enclaves or their history from the perspective of the bilateral relationship that existed between the two countries, um, the border enclaves are in fact a very clear testament of how, say, borders are not always very clear and stable lines of demarcation, and such say confusions have always also been reflected in the manner in which these two states have come together to address this particular issue. Okay. In fact, within such a contested as well as confusing landscape, the presence of, say, territorial categories such as enclaves, what it does is it can be viewed as being disruptive to the perceptions of, say, an uninterrupted and bounded nation, because you have pockets of foreign territory existing within your borders. So, given the peculiarities that these states or these spaces rather represent, it is not not surprising that they have not found a lot of adequate representation in the literature on citizenship, nationhood, or identity. In fact, if you do a quick search of literature based on the land boundary agreement and on the enclaves pertaining to, say, the discipline of international relations, what you will find is mostly analysis that stops at understanding the enclave issue at the point of its resolution. Okay, of course, notwithstanding, there has been a lot of significant contributions in understanding the lives of the people in these spaces that have been conducted by scholars such as Willem van Schendel and Shiuli. All of these different individuals have contributed quite significantly towards understanding the dynamics of such spaces. However, um, what has stopped, say, scholarship on these places beyond resolution is this understanding that these issues stand resolved upon their integration. In fact, the history of the enclaves, subsequent to their integration, becomes basically a history of their adaptation. Okay, in not only responding to the transient dynamics of the state with its limits, but also with regard to the inhabitants of these spaces in replicating some of the functions of the state for themselves, not only during their period of statelessness, as well as beyond it. So, it is only following the liberation war of 1971 that you can basically situate a transference of claims over the enclaves to their respective states. So the historical narratives around the enclaves, it basically comes to be structured in accordance with the context of claims that were made over them by the states in which they were situated. Okay, so without say a lot of attention being put to the experiences that its inhabitants went through in navigating through, say, the complexities of cross-border mobilities, as well as in associating with the discordant religious identities that represented such spaces, and that were in fact established through the two partitions that this period went through. In fact, official documents pertaining to the boundary between India and Bangladesh, they often it represents a necessity to integrate enclaves as a very secondary concern to issues surrounding the undemarcated sections of the border. So, given their embeddedness within national territory, enclaves often feature as a very secondary, let's just say, point of inquiry for states from 1971 onwards. In fact, an exploration of national representations through communications that were put forward by both states, which culminated in the bilateral agreement. In fact, in such representations, the range of issues and conflicts surrounding the enclaves was understood to be based on the larger issue of, say, territorial transfer and the exchange of population. Okay, and if you look at these two elements of territory and population, these are in fact two very fundamental determinants of the idea of the state itself. So, it is no surprise that state-led resolution processes prioritize such a view of the resolution processes. So overall, the bilateral settlement of the enclave dispute reduces this issue to the question of the integration of the stateless spaces without any prior consideration of, say, other associated concerns such as how to facilitate the assimilation of these spaces and inhabitants into the national space, or, say, the need to establish a framework into of, say, framework of support and basic securities with regard to, say, provisions for housing, food, education, and employment, to in order to facilitate, say, the smooth transition into the role of citizens that they were denied till 2015. So, what happens when we look at the idea of resolution constituted as such? It only goes on to establish a very transitory stability, whereby only the most evident causal factors of the issues stand addressed. So, therefore, without having effectively addressed the ground realities of the conflict, the major issues surrounding the enclave residents' struggle with regard to, say, their integration into a national space, as well as their gradual acclimatization into the role of a citizen, it continues to persist even today. So, in fact, the what I was very surprised when I went to the field is that these understandings of absolute statelessness that are often used to represent these enclave spaces in available literature is quite far away from the truth. So when we look at the idea of statelessness, we often associate it with perceptions of, say, helplessness or isolation, or the inability to fend for oneself. But these local narratives that were found through the ethnographic engagement with these narratives, the people and their stories, it reveals a very interesting pattern. In fact, prior to the enclave's integration in 2015, say, claims of validation of identity, assertions over resources, or solicitations for social and spatial mobilities at the local level were in fact negotiated between the enclave and non-enclave residents informally, with the in given that the state was absent. It was basically these interactions between enclave and non-enclave locals that helped fill this void that the state would eventually take up. So the non-enclave locals were basically the purveyors of these benefits by virtue of their status as citizens. In fact, citizenship, as constructed and performed, it came to be locally considered as the most significant index of recognition, as well as a qualifier for, say, participation in local affairs. And in fact, within these enclaved border spaces, access to, say, institutions of governance, healthcare, education, as well as mobilities across public spaces were considered as privileges in the absence of any legitimate channels of access. Okay. So the non-enclave locals, what they did was, given their status as citizens, they began to sublet very comparable privileges of citizenship to meet the enclave locals' demands for recognition and mobility in the absence of the state. So the authority to basically influence participation in local political affairs through such concessions often enabled non-enclave locals to regulate opinions as well as involvement in local affairs through the exercise of this form of control over enclave residents, who were, of course, dependent upon the informal extension of such support and privileges. So the state's absence basically enabled the non-enclave locals to reify and cement their position of influence and power at the local level by maintaining the status quo of this inherent power difference between them and the enclave inhabitants through the extension of what I call a very limited citizenship, or a quasi citizenship. Okay, so through such networks, in fact, a portion of enclave residents were also able to secure voter identification cards, quite surprisingly. And they did so in very interesting ways. So, what they would do is that often enclave residents would, say, cite the addresses of family members and acquaintances who resided outside the enclave's boundaries. Sometimes they would extend a part of their house and construct it beyond the enclave's boundary to in order to qualify for an address. Okay. In fact, a voter ID card, it enabled the enclave residents to bypass a lot of these legal barriers to mobility, as well as it also helped them go past certain local identifications, especially identities such as being temporary, or what was locally referred to as being osthayi. Okay, and They would also use their voter ID cards to assert, say, their belonging to that space. And they wanted to shift away from being identified as cheated lok or enclave resident. So it was in fact a way for them to assert their citizenship or nagorikota during elections mostly. And this was considered to be a symbolic assertion of their larger association to the immediate local that they were embedded within, as well as their membership to the larger state. So the local extension of this quasi-citizenship often encouraged enclave locals to extend, say, the scope of their participation in local matters as well. However, what became very apparent is that such recognitions of enclave residents being citizens was conditional. In fact, the non-enclave locals often recognized um, enclave residents as citizens owing to their residence within the larger national space. Okay, in this regard, local acceptance stemmed from viewing the enclave space as a part of the larger national territory. Okay, and therefore, by extension, the recognition of its occupants as citizens. Okay, so the recognition of enclave inhabitants as citizens came from the fact they had some form of a connection to the land that they inhabited, not the people. So despite being embedded within such local processes of interactions and participation, there was a very marked difference in the position between enclave residents and non-enclave residents. And in fact, such differentiations were often, say, asserted by calling enclave residents chid bashinda or enclave dwellers, despite the fact that they had informally circumvented such official modalities of recognition by securing citizenship papers. So in 2015, the enclave's integration in national territory, it eventually removes all borders or legal barriers to mobility, which had previously been informally negotiated through local support channels. In fact, the state's control over, say, the authentication of citizenship claims, it slowly began to erode the hegemony of the non-enclave locals. And this, of course, leads to a lot of inequalities that I will discuss in the subsequent sections. So, the association of the enclave narrative with, say, externalities that were not necessarily contributive to the engagement with its associated issues, it goes on to significantly modulate the interpretation of the issue at the national and the bilateral levels. In fact, it has impacts on the local levels as well. So the interlinking of the enclave issue with, say, these themes of citizenship and territorial exchange, what it does is it went on to impact upon how enclave inhabitants as well as members of these non-enclave localities came to interpret the larger issue of the exchange of these spaces. In fact, with the transfer of these enclaves, you have the emergence of a lot of different inequalities as well. Okay. In fact, subsequent, as I pointed out in the preceding section, before the state's mediation into these spaces, all of the functions of the state were in fact carried out at an informal level by the non-enclave residents, in participation, of course, with the enclave inhabitants. So the state's identification of the enclave residents as the primary beneficiaries of its welfare schemes that were sought to address some of the gaps that had come in as a result of their 44-year-long, not 70, sorry, 70-year-long isolation from the state. What it did was it cemented some of the differentiations at the local level that had previously been bypassed by such, say, negotiations that had taken place. In fact, these differentiations between enclave and non-enclave locals had been significantly weakened, say through, say, the religious homogenization of these places that took place through various waves of migration, as well as the kind of interactions and interdependencies that had emerged between these two communities, and the kind of services and benefits that were extended to the enclave locals by the non-enclave locals for their participation and engagement in local affairs. So Although, as I pointed out, there were differences in the position of both enclave and non-enclave locals at the local level, there was in fact a shared sense of deprivation that existed among them, something that was shared in perception between the enclave and the non-enclave locals. The moment the state enters into this particular situation in providing the enclave residents with beneficiary as I'm sorry, in recognizing the enclave residents as the beneficiaries of their welfare schemes and basically situating themselves as the purveyors of the benefits and identifications that were previously given to them by the non-enclave locals, there emerges this feeling of inequality amongst the non-enclave locals who had previously worked towards equalizing some of these differences that existed between them, as well as erasing some of the difficulties that existed for the enclave residents in their stateless existence. So eventually, after the initial years of the exchange of enclaves, the state's role in a rehabilitative capacity dwindles quite significantly. And in fact, it is during this time that the recession of, say, the protective armatures of the social capital networks that existed between the local enclave and non-enclave communities, it begins to become very clear and apparent. Okay. In fact, with the insertion of the state, there were more important concerns such as issues surrounding citizenship and land ownership rights that were now being directed through formal institutional channels. In fact, local networks of support that existed prior to the insertion of the state had helped ease a lot of these concerns for the enclave communities. However, with the insertion of the state, their capacities came to be very reduced, very much reduced. However, their scope of functioning became limited. They were not completely decimated. And in fact, their scope of functioning was completely limited to, say, engagement in local issues that were more of an interpersonal nature or dealt with private concerns such as conflicts between individuals or families. So you can see basically a reduction of local capacities to support one another or to cushion some of the impacts of the stateless existence of enclave locals or the presence of such stateless places within the larger local milieu. So all of these different complexities of existence had to a huge extent been reduced. But with the insertion of the state, these local support networks take the back seat. And therefore, over years, their capacities and their influence comes to be eroded. Okay? So as a result, you have basically the emergence of a new local that in fact was somewhere caught in between its old ways of life and these new ways of life emerging subsequent to the insertion of the state that were not completely cemented. Okay, so you have in fact the emergence of inequalities between enclave and non-enclave identities, as well as to some extent the re-enclaving of these spaces as enclaves subsequent to their integration, which runs very contrary to the larger say nature of integration itself, because enclave residents started falling back on their enclave identity to gain certain benefits. It led to the re-emergence of the identity of the enclave individual, which was previously sought to be negotiated through. So it is quite interesting to see such changes happening, say, with the emergence of the state as the main arbiter of all conflicts. In fact, there were in fact a lot of different narratives of the conflict itself that were present in the state, sorry, within this space, that was viewed from various different lenses dependent upon one's own position at the local level. So the interpretation of the issue was also quite different, and it changed across a space of time. So there were in fact a lot of discordant narratives that existed at the local level that shifted between, say, broad stroke assertions either in support or opposition to the exchange. In fact, it was quite dependent upon the positionality of the subject who was constructing such claims. In fact, there were also differences between political allegiances within the enclaves and between non enclave communities. So, with the emergence of the state, you have the complete decimation of a very common identity of the local level, as well as the very common perception of what constituted the enclave issue. And this common identity and perception was fractured into different identities and different perceptions, leading to some form of, let's just say, um, lack of convergence of interests, as well as the lack of convergence of perceptions and ideas regarding this larger issue at the local level, which existed prior to the insertion of the state. In fact, given that there exists now these varied understandings of what the issue is, um, it is very testament to the fact that the local itself cannot be viewed as a very homogeneous construct, and therefore you need to look at the nuances of its existence, the various perceptions of issues and conflicts that exist at the local level. And the impact of the bilateral resolution, which basically restricts the understanding of the local to the issues of citizenship and territorial transfer, in fact, is a very reductivist way of looking at it. And in fact, it glosses over all of these varied perceptions, these different inequalities, divergences that exist at the local level. So, in order to make a lot of these nuances of local conflict very clear, I have also dealt with a case study that I want to present here as well. And this um, basically provides you with the understanding of how these conflicts have operated at the local level, and also provides you with the perspective of the existence of such conflicts from the Bangladeshi side of the border. So, this particular case study is basically based on the former composite enclave of Dahagram Ongarpota, which exists as a part of Bangladesh today. So it is connected to the Bangladeshi mainland through the Teen Bigha corridor. In fact, it has, through the history of its existence, shown various different construals of belonging and patterns of resettlement that have been in line with, say, the trans-territorial identities of its residents with the state that they notionally associate with. So, therefore, this site of inquiry situates itself as a very important uh, point of reference for this study. In fact, the Dahagram Angarpota Juddho or conflict um, emerged in the wake of, the heightening tensions between India and Pakistan in 1965. And in fact, this war, in a lot of ways, or this conflict, it highlights the very conundrum of, say, identification, whereby residents of this space were caught between the influences of, say, the antagonistic nationalisms originating in India and Pakistan at this time, which to a huge extent constituted a very basic form of understanding the influence of the national on the local and as it played out in the borderlands. So, even though participant narratives that were elicited from this particular site, um, they were engaged with to quite a significant extent. They clearly indicated a delineation of such identities, as well as the significant, and the subsequent attachments to religion, nationalism, the identity of enclave residents, the identity of belonging to India or Pakistan. Such perceptions were very confused in such narratives. In fact, through the course of the Dahagram conflict, old linkages of neighborhood and kinship were in fact left fractured. In fact, people from surrounding Indian villages began to identify the enclave and its residents as a source of conflict. And in fact, this contributed to local tensions surrounding the establishment of the Timbika corridor as well. Similarly, the residents of Dahagram Angarpota could not fall back on their sense of familiarity with their detached country of association, because what it would do is it would often invite, say, the displeasure of the neighboring Indian villagers. And in fact, this trend had grown more severe following the conflict, when these differentiations between Hindu and Muslim, Indian and Bangladeshi became quite significant. So the Hindu residents of Dahagram were also caught in a conundrum, because their affiliation to this particular enclave and to Bangladesh came under great local scrutiny. In fact, both within and beyond the enclave's borders. In fact, they were caught in between, say, having to dissociate all ties beyond the border in India, and at the same time, their loyalty to Bangladesh was never accepted by their fellow inhabitants, and which was predominantly the Muslim segment of Dahagram's inhabitants. So the relations between the enclave residents and those belonging to adjacent locales became more stable after the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, whereby people from the surrounding villages began to view Bangladesh and its residents as being culturally similar, a sentiment that was quite frequently mobilized during the 1971 war. So a lot of participant narratives, in fact, they recall how subsequent to the liberation war, relations between them and local residents had in fact improved quite a bit. However, what the partition and its ensuing violence triggered was these waves of migration, whereby Muslim villagers from the Indian side shifted to Dahagram Angarpota, and Hindu residents of Dahagram shifted to India, so as to basically embed themselves within more familiar socialities. In fact, there exists a lot of narratives of dispossession, understandings of belonging and possession within the Dahagram space itself. So the idea of Dahagram itself existing still within India, connected to the Bangladeshi mainland through the Teen Bigha corridor, it is still rooted in this larger idea of transience, whereby, say, prevalent understandings of national belonging, which were derived from and indexed by the larger bilateral conflicts over territory, it basically determined the habitability of the enclave for its residents. Okay, so given the isolation of this particular site from the state, the development of this enclave has been quite skewed. In fact, a lot of welfare schemes of of the Bangladeshi state have not reached this particular enclave, and to a huge extent, even today, the residents of Dahagram Angarpota are dependent upon interactions, economic, social, and cultural, with the other side of the border, that is, with the Indian villages that surround it. In fact, prior to this is in fact a continuation of the kind of relations that existed between these two spaces prior to the integration of Dahagram Angarpota into Bangladesh. And surprisingly, and very surprisingly so, it exists even to this day, whereby people often cross over the border at the more porous sectors of it, which are unmarked and unpatrolled, and they cross over to access markets on the other side of the border, access markets in India. Often, a lot of them are married into families within India because they believe that there is a higher form of stability in association with life across the border. There is still some form of fear that is associated with the kind of geographical position that the enclave finds itself in, dissociated from the mainland, and also the history of violence that it has been a witness to. As a result of which, a lot of these anxieties are in fact undercut by the kind of relations that exist between the people of Dahagram Angarpota, which is a part of Bangladesh, and with its surrounding Indian villages. As a result of which, it is also another testament to the fact that the bilateral, let's just say, resolution of this particular issue did not, in fact, lead to a complete stabilization of the cross-border mobilities and cross-border interactions that the land boundary agreement also wanted to bring forth. And in fact, it is very clear that uh, the kind of conceptualization that the LBA is basically based upon did not take into account the lived realities of the individuals inhabiting these spaces. Therefore, in constituting the problem or the subject of the problem around, say, a very um, uh, unchanging, let's say, unchanging notion of territory or unchanging identity of citizenship, it basically falls very short of understanding the kind of complexities or adaptations or the continuities that continue to exist in the relations that exist between the people of Bangladesh and the people of India shared across an international border. So I'll just conclude really soon. Um, so these are some of the key findings, and in conclusion, I would like to basically spend some time to outline them in accordance to the primary themes of inquiry that this study and this presentation have dealt with. So with regard to the enclaves, their understanding in available literature basically labels them as a very homogeneous category without really looking into or say investigating the kind of divergences that exist not only between two enclaves or two different enclaves separated by a border as well, but differences within enclaves as well. In fact, the nature of differentiations that exist among the former enclave residents primarily played out on the basis of several factors, such as, say, their year of entry into India, or the reasons for their relocation to Bangladesh, the issues of original inhabitancy. I mean, how many generations persisted or lived within the enclave, the religious constitution of the space itself, as well as their proximity to the international border, proximity to non-enclave locals, proximity to sites of conflict. These are some of the major factors that have not really been engaged with in the available literature on enclaves, and these are certain gaps that my study has in fact addressed. So subsequently, say based on the variability of say reference points to one's identity within the enclave spaces, the notions of statelessness and its impacts upon say perceptions and mobilities within enclaves and between enclave and non-enclave locals have also varied quite significantly. As a result, most literature, the manner in which they portray their statelessness or isolation as being absolute, emerges as a very reductivist way of looking at these spaces, and also in understanding the adaptability of people or individuals when faced with such circumstances. So enclaves along the India-Bangladesh border prior to their integration, um, although they existed as stateless spaces, this stateless was by no means absolute. Okay, although in say popular perceptions, statist understandings or construals, statelessness basically rendered them unable to bypass the kind of challenges that would come with it, the obvious challenges that would come with it. This could not be further away from the truth, whereby we see or we have observed a very complex system of interactions and interdependencies that existed between these stateless communities and the communities in their surrounding spaces. So, in fact, as I pointed out prior to their exchange, in fact, enclave residents relied upon interactions with the local population and comprising primarily of non-enclave local residents to circumvent their statelessness and as well as to secure certain basic requirements for subsistence. In fact, these local networks of interactions and exchanges excuse me, were grounded on a shared sense of dependence between these two communities. In fact, the enclave residents were dependent on these informal networks for, say, the validation of their assertions for equal recognition of citizens. And correspondingly, the non enclave populations were reliant on their support in protests, especially mobilized against the transfer of enclave land to Bangladesh, because the idea of the transfer of territory constituted a very key issue of political mobilizations in the borderland, in this particular borderland. So, with the exchange, you also have the conferring of the identity of citizenship, and in fact, the integration of the non-enclave of the enclave residents into the state's fold. It basically leads to a shift of the management of such claims surrounding the validation of identity, assertions over resources, from local social capital networks to the ambits of state authority. So we looked at how it also leads to the emergence of a lot of inequalities, a lot of conflicts that were previously not existent within such spaces. So the idea that the land boundary agreement basically leads to the resolution of all outstanding conflicts surrounding the enclaves, it only holds true with regard to the ideas of territorial integration and the idea of conferring citizenship on the inhabitants. So this understanding of resolution is in fact very incomplete because it bases its approach on a very essentialized understanding of the enclave issue in itself, whereby it does not look at the nuances of its localized existence or the kind of impacts that the presence of enclaves have had on enclave or non-enclave localities, or the kind of interactions that exist between them. And this is primarily based on the understanding that the statelessness of these spaces and of its residents was in fact absolute. So therefore, we must look at the local, okay, as a very key component in understanding conflicts, because these are the spaces within such interactions take place, and these are also the spaces where the state's policies, in order to resolve such conflicts, play out. So the local must be viewed as a very active category in itself, whereby, say, their narratives or localized narratives or conflict are in fact often formed in conjunction or are molded by the perceptions of localized perceptions of the national, or what is bilateral, or what is a conflict, as they consume through, say, the media, through the newspapers, or its articulation in bilateral negotiation processes. So the local being a very active category, it is never static. In fact, the changing perceptions of its inhabitants with regard to a specific issue are often transformed in response to the state's policies towards its mediation or its resolution. So the fact, this understanding that resolution leads to the end of conflict, it needs to be revisited, because often what happens is that it does not lead to a complete erasure of all of these conditions that lead to the emergence of a conflict or support its persistence. What it does often is it often fundamentally alters its character. It may become it may become less visible. It may become, say, more latent, or but the conflict in itself continues to exist in different forms, as a result of which the local as an idea, as a reference point, has to be in fact prioritized in order to fill, say, certain gaps in governance. In fact, the kind of role that they play as informal channels of resource management, legitimization of contested identities, or in facilitating mobilities across certain spaces, the idea of the local has to be viewed as a very active category in such articulations. And with regard to the understanding of, say, the concepts of the national and the bilateral, these are pretty much interconnected, because with, as we've seen with the case of the bilateral resolution of the enclave issue, the agreement for the enclave, the agreement for the land boundary agreement or the deliberations, it went through several cycles, whereby every point when both states came close to an agreement, it represents a point of convergence of their respective national interests. Okay. However, it required both states to come together, which was facilitated by a convergence of several interests. Okay. Um, which eventually leads to the finalization of the agreement in 2015. So, what demands attention at this point is how, over the course of close to 5 decades, almost 44 years, the subject of resolution itself underwent very little modifications. It was only on the issue of territorial transfer and citizenship that often talks held before fell through, and in fact didn't come to fruition. So there needs to be, in fact, there needs to be some recognition of the changing nature of such local spaces and such local interactions in conflict situations. A conflict space never remains static. So, therefore, to view an issue that emerges in 1971 as a key aspect of India Bangladesh bilateralism with regard to the exchange of enclaves, the modes or the means through which its resolution is planned remain static till 2015. Okay, so this leads to the conclusion that state action is often based upon considerations that are exclusive to the realization of its national interests. So, if you look at this particular case, it was the maintenance or the establishment of the regulatory and territorial continuity of the India and Bangladeshi states over the borders. Because enclaves existed as disruptions to this very, say, uniform understanding of the border and the borderlands, these irregularities had to be ironed out. Okay. However, in the process of resolving these disputes, what the resolution processes fail in understanding is that these spaces have changed over time. The nature of their interactions with non-enclave locals or localities have grown more complex. The frameworks of dependence have become numerous. So to view their statelessness as absolute has been a very key gap in the resolution process that has been applied in this regard. As a result of which, the impacts of bilateral resolution at the local level is very apparent with the emergence of new conflicts. And similarly, the local also continues to impact upon bilateral relations between India and Bangladesh because it did not come to resolve problems of, say, illegal migration or the porosity of the border. And in fact, one of the major issues plaguing this area, and in fact, it also constitutes a very significant, say, source of the local economy, is cattle smuggling. So all of these different issues remain unresolved, and as a result, the impacts of the local on bilateral and vice versa continue to exist even today. So I'll end my talk here for now. Of course, I would really like to thank AIRS for giving scholars this opportunity to present their work. And often, as is in my case, it is a very good platform to present one's work, something that I've worked on for so long. And your comments and feedbacks will definitely help me give a final shape before I submit my work to the institutes I'm associated with. Of course, my gratitude goes to my the institutes I'm associated with, NIAS and Jadavpur, who have been so significant to say helping me articulate this idea as well as presenting it and giving it its final forms. And finally, of course, the most important part of any research that is based on ethnography are the respondents, their families, their friends who shared their stories, their homes, and their lives with me, often putting themselves in danger of being of the state itself, or bringing them within the state's sphere of attention as well. So thank you so much. I really look forward to the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Surya, on behalf of heirs and also myself, I would like to thank you for your time and effort this evening. Coming from a certain place myself, and especially the fact that our societies here are so small and more likely to bear the brunt of such things as unmitigated citizenship and such, I believe in the need for such kind of dialogue to take place honestly, and especially pertaining to the power that the local can wield, as you said. So, I would like to wish you all the best with your research. And I really hope your work brings up many more forums for discussion. So, there are some questions that had come up during your talk, and with your permission, I'd like to bring them up now. Okay.
Right.
So, all right. The first question is, how do you think the local can be included in national interest driven bilateral relations between two states?
Okay. So do we go about this one question at a time?
Yeah. That would,
Okay.
that whatever you're fine with.
Yeah, I think this is okay. So that's a very interesting question, and also a question I faced at the institute quite often. Is how do you include the local as a very key reference point in very practical processes of resolution? And of course, dialogical engagement is the best way to go about it. If you look at the formulation of policies, it often happens from a top-down perspective. You have a very essentialized perusal of an issue, whereby its key components are identified by the state and its primary actors, and resolution processes are in fact impacted and implemented per se. So what we need is a very let's just say systematic decentralization of the process, whereby you need to engage with local narratives in order to understand the true nature of the conflict. Of course, when we look at the enclave issue from where we are situated, of course, these understandings make complete sense that, of course, statelessness is absolute, people are helpless, they cannot bypass the kind of problems that they face in their daily lives. But when you go to such spaces, and this is not just only with regard to the border, this can be with regard to any space that has undergone conflict or is still undergoing conflict, you will see that such perceptions often morph when they translate into ground realities. So, what one needs to do in articulating policies towards, say, resolution is you need to engage with local capacities, whether it is with individuals or whether it is with local armatures of governance. Often you will see that you have a lot of networks at these local levels, okay, often transcending borders between states, often transcending borders between different countries. So the idea of conflicts at the local level is much more nuanced, it's much more comprehensive than what is articulated in very statist perceptions or essentialized or perceptions of the same. So you need to bring forth a decentralization of this particular process, and the manner in which you can bring this about is by an empowerment of local capacities. As we've seen in this regard, the local had already devised a way whereby the complexities of this issue could be bypassed. So basically, an empowerment of such local capacities and bringing them into more formal considerations can help in changing such perceptions of conflicts, and in fact can bring forth much steady resolution of issues.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question. The next question would be, could you elaborate on the impact of bilateralism on local conflict management?
Right. Again, a very nice question, in fact, dealing with the larger theoretical implications of the study. When I was reading about this particular issue before I went to the field, my understanding of what the enclave issue was or the conflict surrounding the India-Bangladesh border was completely based upon what I had read, okay, what I had consumed in the form of news reports, media reports, official communications, the text of the land boundary agreement. And surprisingly so, it's not very different at the local levels as well. Often what you will find is your perception of the conflict is often changed by the manner in which these issues are politicized at the ground level. Okay, so the larger narrative of bilateral, say, resolution that underwrote this entire process of enclave exchanges and the conferring of citizenship often went on to color or texture the kind of perceptions that existed at the local level. So you, in fact, I witnessed a fragmentation of different parts of the local. In fact, local sites that were situated away from the border had this perception that yes, you know what, exchange, there should be no exchanges, land should be kept within our national territory. Whereby places that were situated closer to the border were quite, let's just say, sensitive to the nature of struggles that one could have if the border was in fact made very opaque, that you couldn't pass through very easily. So these narratives of bilateralism go on to impact our perceptions of the conflict, as a result of which it goes on to texture the national narrative, I mean the national public narrative, separate from the government's own understanding of these conflicts. And you can see that such ideas, whether it is with regard to the enclaves, whether it is with regard to Kashmir, whether it is with regard to the northeast, Pakistan, you will see that regardless of one's proximity to the site of conflict, everyone has an opinion. Okay, so the narratives of bilateralism or state management of conflicts often goes on to color our perception of conflicts, which in a lot of cases is very different from the ground realities that are existent. And of course, governments will function on the basis of public perception to an extent. It does constitute one of the key planes of governmental action. So if there is pressure on the government to act in a certain way, in more cases than not, the government will act on it to a certain extent. So the impact of bilateralism on local conflict management, often what it does is it imposes a larger public opinion that is dissociated from the realities of the local level on the same local level. So it's basically like having a policy that you know will not work, but that everyone says will work for you. Instead of figuring out a policy or a method that works best for you or is well suited for your needs.
All right. Um, what is okay? The next question is, what are enclaves, and how did you select the three enclaves for your research?
Right. Great question. Enclaves were basically these pockets of, say, India within Bangladesh or Bangladesh within India itself. So imagine, let's just say, a straight line as a border. The way you would understand India and Bangladesh existing is side by side. But due to, say certain irregularities in colonial mapping practices, as well as reasons based in history, very interesting lores around how the enclaves came into being. There are stories about how kings of this region would play chess, and in fact, they would bet on certain pockets of territory that they held, and as a result of which certain pockets of territory went exchanged hands. And once borders were stabilized, these pockets of territory remained sovereign in the nature of their relation to the state of association. So enclaves are basically, say, stateless pockets that existed on different either side of the border. So parts of India within Bangladesh and parts of Bangladesh within India. That is the most easiest way of understanding what enclaves are. And in fact, these are not just very exclusive to South Asia. In fact, enclaves have existed all over the world. There are enclaves of different parts of, I think, European countries and different embedded in other countries as well. But the main difference is with regard to the extension of governance. With European countries, the extension of governance beyond one's territorial borders has not been a very difficult process to, say, respond to through policies and acts and rules. Whereas with regard to South Asia, given our contentious history, given the partitions that we've gone through, you will see that states have very violently and very strongly held on to their notion of sovereignty. And the idea of sharing their sovereignty beyond their borders becomes often inconceivable. So think of an enclave as a part of India that exists within Bangladesh. Now think of the kind of complexities that will arise out of such a
Yeah.
territorial situation. So
There's so much going on both sides.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you can imagine the kind of impacts that it will have on people. So one story that I
Exactly.
came across is this one farmer who still exists, who still resides within India, was an original inhabitant of that enclave. How he said that during the rainy season, because their lands would get flooded, they were forced to move to Bangladesh, and so many of them were caught, okay, because they were illegally crossing the border. So one year they decided, okay, we'll not move to Bangladesh, we'll move into India. And of course, because they existed as a part of Bangladesh within India, they were caught when they moved to India itself because they didn't have passports. And the problem they faced was, in order to gain access to a passport, they had to cross the border illegally to go to a passport office. So you can see how they were constricted within their own territorial confines, and it was these relations with non-enclave locals that helped bypass a lot of these problems. Okay, so
Wow.
second part of the question, the manner in which I go about selecting these sites of research is primarily based on a few different um, conditions. So I had prepared a list of enclaves. So the idea of enclaves as stateless spaces, although true, what I found when doing my pilot survey is that not all enclaves were inhabited. Okay. So, firstly, inhabitancy was the main concern for understanding, for selecting which enclaves I would study. Secondly, because I was understanding the impacts of bilateral, resolution or at the local level and vice versa, I also had to select enclaves that were close to the border. Certain enclaves were further away from the border, as well as, and also by extension, the conflicts of the border as well. I also selected these enclaves on the basis of proximity to local sites of conflict. Dahagram Angarpota is very well researched. In fact, there's a very nice paper by Jason Cons on Dahagram Angarpota, basically stating the kind of troubles or anxieties that were held onto people of this space through the period of 1965, 71, and then 2015. So there was a vast list of criteria that was used. The most significant markers being proximity to the border, proximity to local sites of conflict, proximity to non-enclave villages as well as the enclaves, of course, had to be inhabited, and they had to have a recorded, say, inhabitancy since the point of 1971 till 2015 and beyond. Okay, because I had visited enclaves that were completely deserted, that had been converted into tea farms as well. So these were some of the major criteria based on which I selected these enclaves for my research.
Thank you. All right. The next question is, what are some practical ways in which the states can include the local aspirations in bilateral relations between states?
Okay, so again, this in a lot of ways falls back to the first question that I answered. Empowerment of local voices is definitely very important. Remember, in a lot of cases, to put it simply, people in these places know what is best for them. Okay, and by that, I'm not advocating that what they want is to do things their way. No, they very well know how to work within, say, the boundaries of governance, or what is legitimate, what is illegitimate. In a lot of cases, they have a more nuanced understanding of the laws of the state or the rules of the state than we do. In fact, these understandings are in fact imbibed within them from a very young age through stories, through lores. In fact, a very good example is when I first went. I had this one friend who was showing me around. He was a local boy there, and he was very helpful. He showed me around the place, and in fact, we arrived at one point whereby it was just open field. Okay, I almost crossed over, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You know what? The border starts here. You cross over, you're going to get arrested." So he knows where the border starts, where the border ends, without even looking for a marker. And in fact, these places have no markers. You'll find some very small, very badly eroded border stones which are not even visible. So I almost crossed over, and he stopped me. So their perceptions of the state's limits, their understanding of the laws and rules are much more clear than ours. So there needs to be some empowerment of their own opinions, of their perceptions, because we must understand that they have navigated through the complexities and the realities of existence within such conflict spaces for generations. So empowerment is definitely one practical way in which the states can include their aspirations in bilateral resolution processes. And secondly, the decentralization of such processes. Often what happens, decentralization often stops at the level of the state, because this particular issue came into a lot of gridlock when the center came into conflict with the states that were involved with the exchange. West Bengal most notably. So the West Bengal government was quite against this, stating that it would lead to a lot of problems, and therefore they often stalled, say, the resolution process from taking over. So the point of decentralization has to be extended not only to the states but beyond it, to encompass local voices, to create avenues for their participation, to bring forth their ideas into resolution processes. In fact, before their integration, these stateless pockets had, in fact, replicated governmental structure where they would have informal, say, councils who would sit and deliberate on such affairs. So, if you go through some of the records of these meetings, the kind of solutions that they have advocated are novel and, in fact, quite practicable, but none of them have been implemented. So, the means exist. What we really need to bring about is an empowerment and a formalization of such means and of such avenues.
Okay. I don't think there are any more questions. Are there? No. Thank you so much, Surya. I think this was
Thank
so
you.
informative, like even for me. This is something, I mean, we think about it, obviously, but not in such an objective, organized manner, and something that thinks about both sides. I really, really enjoyed this talk, despite the fact that I probably didn't really know the meaning of enclave at first either. So thank you, whoever asked that question. All right. So on that note, I'd like to end this lecture, and I'm just going to give you guys the vote of thanks. So I'm sure that you will all agree when I say that it was a great learning experience to hear Surya, set out his lucid arguments for us. It was also very enthusiastic delivery and a lot of command over the topic, a lot of command over the answering of the questions as well. I thank the president of AIRS, Ariba, for conceptualizing, realizing, and bringing to fruition this lecture, and also for making me moderate this lecture. Otherwise, I would have not heard, I would have not been able to hear it. I would also like to thank our speaker for taking the time out, despite your busy schedule, and giving us this enlightening lecture. So I also thank all the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. I'd like to make a special mention of Aruna Anil Kumar, Ajab Rangoon, Wala, and Manasa. We at AIRS are very grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination of the speaker as well, the participants, and the entire team at AIRS. Under the unfailing guidance of our president, who is Ariba Asnat Muazzam, this event was made possible. Thank you, and we hope to see you all on our 33rd webinar on July 31st. It is a book discussion on Flying Blind India's Quest for Global Leadership by Mohammad Zishan. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Yadu Chaudhary, Assistant Professor, University of Jaipur, Rajasthan. So have a great night, all of you. Till next time. And
Thank you.
goodbye.